In the course of history, Cadillac has really been known for producing a significant number of wagons, although it has definitely done so. And I have to say, my favorite is the pictured CTS V wagons that were produced from around 2010 to 2014. They just were awesome vehicles, tons of power, great looks. Still something that's actually now collectible, even though they're not that old. And some of these are commanding very high prices. But in the past, Cadillac also experimented a bit with station wagons, and there were a number of custom producers of wagons that converted Cadillacs into station wagons. Most prominently, the so-called Fleetwood Castilian wagon that you see here that was produced in the mid-1970s, and allegedly only 11 were produced by traditional coachworks. Although I have to say, there seem to be quite a few of these up for sale, and either they all were perfectly preserved by their owners or there were more than 11 produced. I think the latter is my guess. After all, a number of celebrities allegedly own these, including Sammy Davis Jr. and some others. And it's not necessarily my favorite wagon. It's kind of like a Cadillac-y clamshell, but not a clamshell. They have a liftgate in the rear, a full liftgate. As opposed to the clamshell where the glass goes into the roof and then the door drops underneath the bumper. This was just a traditional liftgate, as you can see here, and was certainly expensive. But this, nonetheless, was one of the Cadillac wagons that, again, wasn't produced by Cadillac Motor Division, but was produced by an aftermarket company for customers who really wanted an upscale wagon. Aside from the Cadillac, the most expensive wagon that you could get was the Buick Estate wagon, which was quite nice overall. But what we're going to talk about today is the proposal that you see here for a station wagon based on the 1971 Cadillacs, and something that was actually getting evaluated in-house at General Motors. These photos are photos from GM's archives that show a potential production 1971 Cadillac wagon and what it looked like. And I have to say, the thing is gosh darn good looking. So let's talk about it a little bit now. Now remember, for 1971, the Cadillacs were all new during this particular time frame. And that involved not only the full-size DeVille and Fleetwood series and the Calais, if you were somebody who wanted the more affordable Cadillac, that's an oxymoron, as well as the Eldorado. And what you can see here from this particular photo is this is a proposal for a wagon based on the Eldorado. And I wonder if that meant that it's front-wheel drive, because obviously the Eldorado was front-wheel drive. But you can see it would have shared its hood, its front grille, the fenders, probably even the front doors, the A-pillars, the windshield, the front door glass. All of that kind of from the front door forward was effectively Eldorado, and very handsome. 71 Eldorado had this beveled theme to the hood as well as the rear, and you'll note that beveled theme is present here in the hood, and between that and the grille, you can tell that this really was an Eldorado-based proposal. A couple other things I'll note from this proposal is that, number one, you'll notice that it appears, if I can see the picture correctly, it looks like this has the concentric ring wheel covers, which would be introduced for 1972. Cadillac just couldn't produce them in time, and so they went with a carryover wheel cover in 1971. And this 71 Eldorado-based proposal, though it is Eldorado-based, there are shared components between the DeVille and the Eldorado series. Most prominently up front, that bumper center bar is actually shared with the license plate in the middle of it. That was something that was shared between the Eldorado series and the DeVille, Fleetwood, and the Calais series. So the hoods and the grills have the same plan view because they had to share that same bumper center bar. So they needed the same point to the V, even though the cars have a different look up front. Now, we talked about the bevel theme on the hood and all those shared portions that I mentioned. One thing that's interesting to me is the 71 Eldorado was really conceived with this four-fendered theme. And you'll notice if you look at the production car, you'll see clearly the front fender has this separate form from the rest of the car. The front fender kind of continues on into the door. And then there's a rear fender, which on the production car is kind of denoted by a replica of a mid-50s era Cadillac trim piece that here is absent on the wagon. And I'm not quite sure why it's not on the wagon. It made it through to the production 1971 Eldorado, but for whatever reason, that trim piece is missing here in the wagon proposal. That piece of trim would have really started that rear fender form and perhaps helped accentuate it just after the door, but it doesn't exist here. Now, in any case, you can tell the Castilian wagon that we were talking about was a four-door Fleetwood-based proposal. And here you have the Eldorado, as I was mentioning, the Eldorado-based proposal. This is only a two-door wagon, so it's not all that practical. But I have to say, I think the car looks better as a two-door wagon. And as we go through other photos, you'll notice that for whatever reason, Cadillac seemingly was only entertaining these two-door wagon proposals as opposed to four-door. So they wanted a wagon, but they didn't want to go all in. It was kind of like a Chevrolet Nomad in that sense. The stylish wagon, the upscale wagon, which was really a two-door, less about function and I think more just about overall shape and occasional carrying capabilities. Now, as we rotate to the rear of this particular proposal, I think it's even more attractive. You'll notice that you still have the Eldorado-style tail lamps out back, but you don't have really the bevel theme that the Eldorado had on the rear with the deck lid. Although what you do have is an interesting kind of crease running down the middle of the wagon and the rear, I guess I'll call it tailgate for lack of a better term. And the rear window also has a crease in it. So this very sharp crease in the middle of the rear for the tailgate, which I don't know how this tailgate would operate. It looks like maybe it's a hatch, and so that entire piece would lift up, making it similar to the Castilian, different from the clamshell wagons that were being developed at the time. It also looks like there are some louvers behind the B-pillar or something going on there that's a little bit different than other wagons of the era. I do love how toothpicky the rearmost pillars are, and it just gives the wagon this huge expanse of glass that surrounds that entire rear area. You also have a bumper that's relatively conventional. You don't have that deck lid theme from the 71 Eldorado continuing on into the bumper because, obviously, the overall rear doesn't have that same form. So that's one thing that's kind of missing. I wish that the designers would have been able to find a way to incorporate that bevel theme out back like they had in the 71 Eldorado production variant to help kind of tie the front of the car to the rear. Whereas here, they're a little bit different, but I guess I don't know what else you're going to do with a wagon. This car is also interestingly devoid of a roof rack, and I think that really helps it, although that roof is almost perfectly flat, something that you rarely saw on General Motors cars. You almost always had kind of this taper toward the rear. The roof would kind of sag a little bit as it went rearward on the car. Here it looks like the roof panel is very, very flat, and I guess that makes sense. In a wagon, you're trying to have headroom for the rear seat passengers and more space back there. Overall, though, I have to say, at least by my eye, this is a pretty gosh darn attractive wagon, and would have been a compelling proposal back in the day, although not so practical as it was stylish. And here we have the proposal out on the design patio at General Motors Design, and I suspect that lettering behind the front wheel says Eldorado is my guess, although it's hard to make out here. But you do notice that the designers have done a couple things. They've made it two-toned, so that area behind the door glass is a different color, and it looks like that kind of continues on through part of the quarter panel and around the back of the vehicle. It's a nice look, I think, overall, and again, a very stylish wagon. I have to say, I'm surprised that by this point that trim piece didn't make it on there that I was mentioning before that really kicked off that rear fender form. Maybe it was just thought to be too much with that B-pillar there, the chunky B-pillar. And this one does have a roof rack, so you're starting to get some of the typical station wagon accoutrements on this particular proposal. And I have to say, it was the 1970s, so you've got a dark green. And a lot of 1970s era cars, these big, huge cars, I think, look great in dark green. Some people don't like green cars, but I think it suits the car very, very well. Also notice the wide rocker molding, that big piece of bright work, helping to slim the body a little bit visually and also provide some semblance of, let's say, upper level trim. This is, after all, a Cadillac, so you got to have a wide rocker molding in addition to the Squircle style wheel arches, because that was also a very typical Cadillac trait of the era. Also notice that there are no louvers aft of the B-pillar on this particular proposal, and I suspect designers were just experimenting with a few different proposals for that B-pillar and the back glass, because you're going to see in one more photo that we have that those louvers are back. And I think that designers were just trying to find what looked right, and the two-tone color scheme probably obviates the need for those louvers just visually. And here we have a final proposal. This one is inside Cadillac Studio. This looks like a full-size model that was in Cadillac Studio at the time. And notice this one does have a two-tone paint scheme, but not the same as the previous one. The B-pillar is colored the same as the body color. The louvers are back. You have the roof rack. I've got to say, this is a pretty gosh darn good-looking wagon, although I don't know how they would make that rear hatch executable with those super toothpicky rearmost pillars. I suppose it could be done. I'm sure the engineers could work on that. But again, just an attractive wagon, and I have to say, if this were produced in the early 1970s, maybe it had a fighting chance. Station wagons today aren't very popular, but they certainly were very popular back in the 1970s before the introduction of the minivan. A lot of families used to use those, but again, being a two-door wagon, I don't think this was so much about practicality as it really was about style. And I, for one, am a little bit, I'll say, faintly disheartened that Cadillac never produced this, because I think it would be a great collectible today. I think people would just clamor after this. Wagons today are super collectible. GM clamshell wagons and some of the Ford wagons and the Chrysler wagons, if they're in great shape today, will command very high prices because there just aren't many left, and they're kind of cool pieces of nostalgia. This, if this were had been something that was produced, I have to say I think that this would be super collectible today and super valuable, just like the CTS V wagons are. And like I mentioned, they're not even that old. But this wagon, I think it's a shame that Cadillac wasn't able to produce it. And you would have had the 500 cubic inch V8 underhood. It would have been a front wheel drive wagon. How cool is that? None of those wagons from the era, the full-size wagons, were front-wheel drive. They were all rear-wheel drive. So you would have had a completely different powertrain. You would have had Cadillac's 8.2-liter 500 cubic inch V8 underhood with a turbo-hydromatic 425 front-wheel drive transmission. I think this thing really could have been a winner. You would have had great traction up front, just given the weight over the front wheels. Would have been a great winter sled to kind of drive around in the winter time. And you had kind of that silky smooth power delivery the Cadillac had from its 500 cubic inch V8 all the way back to when that engine was introduced for the 1968 model years, a 472 cubic inch V8, before it would be enlarged to 500 cubic inches. You couldn't get that V8 engine in anything else. That was a Cadillac exclusive. And the 500s really were wonderful engines. Unfortunately, in the latter part of the 1970s, they started to lose their horsepower as emission standards became increasingly important. But they still were whisper quiet and very, very smooth. So what do you think? Should Cadillac have produced a wagon like this? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.